And thanks, Andrew. Hello and welcome to our second climate catch-up with A2E2 New South Wales. I'm Sue Martin, President of A2E2 New South Wales, the New South Wales chapter of our association. Many of you will know me because we're here among our peers of environmental educators, but I have been passionate about caring for country and working with fellow environmental educators as we create a sustainable future. So thank you all for joining us. A little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded so that we can share it afterwards. If you do not want to be videoed, please just turn your video off and keep yourself on mute throughout. There will be an opportunity for questions, so please put them in the chat and we'll try and follow that as we go. And the wonderful Andrew and Chai in our background will keep this running, so thank you. I do want to begin acknowledging country. A2E2 New South Wales acknowledges the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this nation. We acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which A2E2 New South Wales members live, learn and work. We pay our respects to ancestors and elders past, present and all those who may be joining with us today. A2E2 New South Wales is committed to honouring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, waters and seas and their rich contribution to our society. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And as our association begins our gatherings here together, we also want to acknowledge the context. So we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the context within which we gather today. We meet at a time when human species is having an unprecedented impact on the planet. We do this at the beginning of this gathering as a reminder that the discussions we have here, the decisions we make and any actions we take as a result will have consequences for other people and other species, both those living now as well as future generations. And it would be lovely to hear from you from what country you're joining us from, and please add that to the chat. This is our second climate catch-up, a way to support environmental educators working on the biggest environmental education issue we are facing, climate. Communicating about climate change is the most important thing we can all do, but as the biggest threat to our very existence, it can be a hard topic to discuss. Because A2E2 New South Wales has been communicating and engaging with communities about our environment since 1976, we feel we are well placed to support you to do this critical work. In 2019, we declared a climate emergency, and this year we adopted a climate emergency response plan. These are both available on our website, and we will be sharing more information on these next year. In declaring a climate emergency, A2E2 New South Wales has joined the millions of people around our planet who are working to mitigate the dangerous impacts of climate change and regenerate the natural systems on which all life depends. We draw hope and optimism from knowing that we are part of this global community who care and who are taking action to rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and draw down carbon from our atmosphere. By working together with courage, we can increase Australia's ambition to solve the climate crisis. So with our conversation today, I'd like to introduce Lesley Hughes. We are thrilled to have a very Lesley Hughes join us from the Climate Council. Lesley is a distinguished Professor of Biology and Pro Vice-Chancellor of Research, Integrity and Development at Macquarie University. Her research has mainly focused on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems. She is a former Federal Climate Commissioner and former lead author on the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment reports. She is founding Councillor with the Climate Council of Australia, a director for WWF Australia, and a member of the Wentworth group of concerned scientists. Lesley has also joined with us at our A2E2 conferences in the past, and in 2020 was our A2E2 New South Wales Environmental Educator of the Year. So I feel Lesley is one of us, and I just so love listening to you, Lesley, and learning from you. But after hearing from Lesley, we'll be breaking into smaller groups to reflect and to connect. Over to you, Lesley.
Well, thank you very much, Sue, and good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here with my friends at A2E2. I've been watching the names of the people as they've been arriving and recognise many. So it's really great to be here with you. I'm going to start to share my screen now. Hope everybody can see a picture of a bushfire. So what I've been asked to do today is the second of your climate catch-ups. And what I'll be doing mostly is unpacking COP26. But before I do that, I also want to talk about the latest IPCC report, because it's really important context for what happened in Glasgow. Once I sort of unpack the key messages of that report, I'll talk about the successes and failures of Glasgow, because it's a complex thing. And then finally talk about where Australia is in that mix. That won't be a very happy story, as I'm sure you'll be all aware. Well, the last IPCC report, which is the first report of the 6th assessment, was released last August with the tagline that climate change is widespread, rapid and intensifying. And Antonio Guterres, who's the head of the UN, had this wonderful description, really, code red for humanity, because that's what it is. And of course, it's not just code red for humanity, but it's code red for every species that we share this planet with. There are over 1 million words in this report. It summarised and synthesised 14,000 references, but I want to boil down the findings to a few key things that, you know, for any of you that know anything about climate change, won't be particularly surprising, but will have been emphasised. So the first key finding, of course, is now unequivocal that human activities have warmed the atmosphere, the ocean and the land, and this is causing widespread and rapid changes. And the second key finding is that the scale and the pace of this change has almost no precedent in the 4.5 billion year history of this planet. So we now have nearly 50% more CO2 in the atmosphere than in pre-industrial times. It's the highest level for at least 2 million years and probably much longer than that. And importantly, the rate of increase of CO2 in the atmosphere over the past 20 years is about 100 times the maximum rate during the last ice age. Another report that came out just prior to the IPCC report, but which didn't get quite as much publicity, but is nonetheless incredibly important, is one from NASA. The NASA report estimated that the amount of heat now trapped near the Earth's surface by all this extra greenhouse gas has about doubled since just 2005. So that just shows you how quickly things are changing. And the Earth is now nearly 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, warming faster than really anybody had previously expected. So this is a graph from the IPCC report. I won't show you very many graphs in this talk, but this is an important one, basically showing that over the past 2,000 years, for much of that time, the Earth was actually cooling down. Come post the Industrial Revolution, it's been warming up. And we're now way outside the past sort of envelope of both CO2 and global surface warming. The oceans are absorbing more than 90% of this excess heat for now. We can now detect warming down to a depth of about 2 kilometres. The oceans are also absorbing much of that extra CO2 in the atmosphere, but that is changing the chemical composition of seawater, making it more acidic, with our oceans now on average being 30% more acidic than in pre-industrial times. The other thing, of course, that's been happening is that sea level rise has been accelerating. It's going up now at about 3 times the rate that it was in the 1990s. And it's occurring for 2 reasons. Firstly, the extra fresh water going into the oceans from melting glaciers and polar ice caps, but also because that warmer water is less dense than cooler water, it's occupying more volume. So a substantial amount of that sea level rise is simply occurring because the water is warmer. Third key finding, also unsurprising, I think for all or most of you, is that the impacts of this are accelerating. Here's some of those. So our global water cycle is said to be intensifying, and what that means is that dry areas are tending to become drier, wet areas tending to become wetter, and because a warmer atmosphere is capable of holding more water, that means that, and it's also got a lot more energy in it, it means that when it does rain, the rain tends to come down in more intense bursts, and that's when we get flooding. Cyclone intensity and therefore impacts of cyclones are also increasing. There's now serious consideration of the need of a Category 6 for cyclones. Extreme heat and heat waves are also increasing. Globally, 2020 was the hottest year on record, with the previous 7 years being the hottest 7. Here in Australia, 2019 was our hottest year. We are now, as at the end of last year, more than 1.4 degrees above what we were in 1910. So in 2019, for example, there were 3 times the number of extremely hot days as in any year in the last century. And in January 2020, Penrith, for example, had the dubious distinction of being, Penrith's in Western Sydney, for those of you that don't live around here, Penrith was the hottest place on earth at nearly 49 degrees. Now, we're all aware that bushfire seasons are lengthening and becoming more severe. In some parts of Australia, they're now about 2 months longer than they used to be. A very recent CSIRO study, it only came out the week before last, looked at how bushfires can be attributed to recent climate change, finding that climate change has been driving an 800% boom in the amount of land burned by bushfires in the last few years and decades. We all remember the so-called Black Summer bushfires. Of course, Black Summer is a misnomer because these bushfires started in late winter in July 2019. They burnt right through to January 2020. And in that period, more than 18 million hectares of Australia was burnt. And that's about 3 times the size of Tasmania. Key finding number 4 is that these worsening impacts are actually sort of baked into the climate system for at least the next 2 decades. What that means is if we were able, by some miracle, to stop emitting greenhouse gases like methane and CO2 tomorrow, we would still get significant warming because it's baked in. This is a graph from a recent Climate Council report showing that. So we're already actually locked into at least a 0.2 to 0.6 degrees of warming, regardless of what we do in the next few decades. That means we're committed to a temperature rise of somewhere between 1.3 and 1.7. which means that we're very likely to exceed 1.5 degrees, which is what everybody talks about, in the early 2030s. And what we've got to work very hard to do is to actually bring that back then. We'll overshoot the 1.5 almost certainly. We've got to work hard then to bring it back. Sorry, that was my phone. Key finding number 5. That the projected changes in these extremes of climate events are larger in both frequency and intensity with every additional increment of global warming. What this means is that every fraction of a degree is having an impact. Here's a graph from the IPCC report, a table. You don't have to worry about the detail. I'll point out the important things. The IPCC report came up with 5 emission scenarios from low to high arranged in this table. This is what I want to point out. The national pledges thus far will get us to about a 2.7 degrees of warming by the end of this century. Current policies, and these are pre-COP policies, will get us to 3.6 degrees. Now, just for context, remember what I just said is that we've already warmed about 1.2 degrees and we've seen what the impacts of that has been. Imagine doubling or tripling that amount of warming. At 4.4 degrees, at the highest scenario, that's when we would expect very significant positive feedbacks to the climate system, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Another key finding of the IPCC report was about methane. Methane doesn't get nearly the attention that CO2 gets, but increasingly methane needs to get more attention because, well, for 2 reasons. The warming now caused by methane is about 2/3 of that caused by CO2. In that graph, CO2 is the first bar, methane is the second bar in terms of its impact on warming. Measured over a short time period, methane is actually about 80 times as effective at trapping heat next to the Earth as CO2. Methane doesn't hang around in the atmosphere nearly as long as CO2. It's a sort of a short-term die-fast gas, but while it's there, it has a very, very big impact. Methane emissions have been going up steeply, about 156% compared to the 50% from the pre-industrial levels. About 60% of that comes from human activity, including agriculture and fossil fuels, with the rest from natural processes. The methane from fossil fuels comes about through both gas and coal mining, particularly from the fugitive emissions from things like gas fracking. As I indicated, tipping points, that is positive feedbacks to the Earth system, the IPCC found that these could be catastrophic and simply cannot be ruled out. The more we warm the planet, the closer to these tipping points we inevitably become. Here's some illustrations of some of those tipping points that the report talks about. If I go clockwise round from the top left, the Amazon rainforest is being converted into a source of carbon dioxide rather than a sink, as it has traditionally been, partly through drying, partly through clearing, and both of those things together, both human activities and drying, have increased the amount of fires. The other top picture is just an illustration of the melting of the permafrost, which is now starting to put a lot of CO2 and methane into the atmosphere that was previously held frozen in the soil. I've briefly mentioned the melting of glaciers, the melting of polar ice sheets, which are melting at an accelerating rate. And then, of course, there are all sorts of biological tipping points. And the one that we know the most about, of course, is bleaching of coral reefs. If we get to 2 degrees, well over 90% of the world's coral reefs that are there now could disappear entirely. Finally, and this is the real sort of silver lining of what is a pretty depressing report, is that while the window for effective action is closing rapidly, it hasn't closed completely, and the climate future is still in our hands. But what that means is that what we do in the next decade is the critical thing. It's not what we do by 2050, it's what we do by 2030 that really counts. Which brings me to the Glasgow COP. Now, I'm just showing you this slide to give you an idea about how complicated negotiations at these meetings actually are. If if you looked at, these are sort of putting all of the countries who are parties to the UNFCCC convention, arranged in the blocks that they tend to work in. And as you can see, there's a lot of countries in multiple blocks. The blocks overlap. All of these blocks of sort of voting countries have different agendas, and some of those agendas are not aligned with each other. So, you know, when I look at a graph, a picture like this, I think it's a wonder that anything is ever agreed. It's a triumph, really, that we come out with any form of declaration at all. The outputs of these sorts of meetings internationally are of two sorts. There are political outputs, which tend to be the announcements, the declarations, the pledges, the statements. These are non-binding, of course, and they're essentially unenforceable. Then there's the procedural or so-called legal outputs, which are known as decisions. Formally, these are binding on countries, but binding is an interesting word in this context. There is no global policeman that will throw a president or a prime minister in jail if their country doesn't meet their commitment. So binding is a sort of also an interesting term in this respect. But these do represent the real action that can be monitored and reported into the future. So things like rules around carbon offsets, how emissions are reported, how global finance will flow, tend to come under the decision bucket. The political things tend to happen in the first week of these COPs, which go for 2 weeks. And the decisions tend to happen in the second week. So what happens is that the global leaders fly in at the beginning, they have their photos taken, they make their big announcements, then they go home. And then the real work of negotiation is done by government representatives in the second week. There was one important exception to this generality that I'll get to in a moment. So you'll all be aware, I think, that the previous most important climate agreement was made in Paris in 2015 with the aim to keep global surface temperature to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and aspiring to keep it to less than 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, the pledges made to the Paris Climate Agreement by the parties, if met 100% and on time, will still get us to somewhere between 2.7 and 3 degrees. Way too much warming. The end of the Paris Climate Agreement, though, brought great optimism to anybody interested in the future of the planet. It seemed truly like a hugely positive moment. Everybody was smiling, as you can see there. But if you look to see what's happened since then, perhaps the outcome is less positive. This is a graph of emissions globally. As you can see, they continue to go up exponentially. That's where the Paris Agreement was, and you can see that since the Paris Agreement, emissions have continued to go up. You'd be interested to know that there was a little blip attributed to COVID, because COVID in the first year or so reduced economic activity and reduced emissions. But as countries have been ramping up their economic activity again, emissions have once again begun to climb. Just prior to the Glasgow COP, the UN put out their annual synthesis report, which is an acknowledgement of where emissions were going. And they calculated that there would be a 16% emissions increase based on trends to that point by 2030 compared to 2010. Once again, reiterating the fact that this level of emissions will lead to a 2.7 degrees increased temperature by 2100. So that's the context of what everybody was facing going into Glasgow last November. Glasgow quite rightly then had a real focus on 2030 emissions reduction targets, and the mantra at that meeting was to keep 1.5 degrees alive. I've just explained how difficult staying below 1.5 degrees is likely to be, but that was very much the focus of the meeting. You might be interested to know that, of course, it's not people that go along to these meetings are not just people that want to reduce emissions. In fact, the number of delegates from fossil fuel companies, gas, oil and coal, outnumbered the number of delegates from any individual country at over 500 delegates of fossil fuel companies. At the bottom of this graph is the UK, which had only half that number, despite the fact that they were hosting the meeting. Fortunately, however, many of our major partners and allies did commit just prior to the COP to really significant reductions in emissions by 2030. So here's some of the most notable ones. So the EU is committed to a 55% reduction. These have slightly different baselines, but a lot of the baselines are 2005. The US committed to a 50% reduction, the UK a whopping 68%, Canada 40 to 45, Japan 46. So they were all really welcome developments. One really welcome development occurred on day 2 of the meeting, which will be of particular interest to environmental educators, which is that the many countries signed on, more than 100 countries, including Australia, signed on to the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests and Land Use, with a pledge to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. The signatories are basically in charge of about 85% of the world's forests, and that included significant pledges, thus far about $26 billion. So that was good. Day 2 was a very big day because it also saw the global methane pledge, aiming to reduce methane 30% by 2030. This was really led by the US. 100 countries, more than 100 countries signed on. Unfortunately, Australia, Russia and China did not sign. Day 3 was all about transitioning from coal to clean energy. There was a global coal to clean energy transition statement signed on by 190 countries and large organisations, vowing to phase out coal power and end support for new coal-fired power stations. Unfortunately, once again, Australia, the US, India and China didn't sign it. Day 5 was really money day, and this is probably the most important part of the conference. $130 trillion on the table to put climate at the heart of global capital. So there was a coalition of most of the major companies around the world to this commitment. Probably this was the most significant thing, I think, that happened at the COP. Day 6 was the day for civil society. More than 100,000 people marched through the streets of Glasgow, mostly in the rain, but then it is Scotland, including, of course, the one and only Greta. Now, day 9 took people by surprise because, as I said earlier, most of the big announcements happen in the first week, but then there was a really big announcement in the second week between the United States and China, announced a joint climate change pact. It was sort of announced by Joe Biden and President Xi, but in fact, these two guys here were really responsible. John Kerry, the US envoy, climate envoy, and Xi Jinping from China, who had worked together for months, very, very hard to get this pact up. Interestingly, it's very much focused on what happens between now and 2030. The 2020s are repeated about 8 times in the relatively short 6-page document, and it's in the title as well. So amongst other things, China is committing to peaking CO2 emissions by halfway through this decade. The end of the meeting was a little bit more of a damp squib compared to the end of the Paris meeting. There were some definite moves forward, but there was some last minute watering down of the final agreement. And that's what the media has mainly focused on. So was it a success? Well, it was a glass is half empty, glass is half full scenario, I think. If we think about future emissions, and this is a graph from the IPCC report looking at those different sorts of future emissions scenarios. As I said before, the Paris pledges get us to somewhere between 2.7 and 3 degrees. The new pledges under the Glasgow Agreement get us to 2.4 degrees. So better than 2.7, but still twice as much of a temperature increase as we've had so far. So still, we're not there yet. Here's a couple of significant things from the statement that came from Glasgow called the Glasgow Climate Pact. And this has some pluses and minuses. So Article 36 mentioned that we needed to accelerate efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, this is the first time that the word coal and the words fossil fuel subsidies have ever been in a COP statement, and there have been 26 COPs. So that's significant. At the last minute, it was originally going to say phase out, and it was watered down at India's insistence to phase down. And then there's a couple of weasel words here: unabated coal power, inefficient coal subsidies, which sort of implies that abated coal power, that is with carbon capture and storage, is okay. And it also implies that there is such a thing as an efficient fossil fuel subsidy, which of course I'd say most of us would disagree with. But nonetheless, the fact that coal was in there was significant. Another significant thing that was a little bit surprising about the Glasgow Climate Pact was this Article 29, requesting that the parties revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets and bring back those strengthened targets to the next COP meeting, which is in Egypt next year. Now, under the Paris Climate Agreement, parties agreed to review their targets every 5 years, not every year. So this is basically upping the ante. It's an acknowledgement that the targets for 2030 are not yet strong enough. And so it's saying you have to come back next year with better ones. This is Antonio Guterres, who I mentioned before. He's a bit of a glass half empty guy. He was pretty disappointed clearly at the outcome, noting that the texts were a compromise, contradictory, and reflect the state of political will in the world today. He says, our fragile planet is hanging by a thread. We are still knocking on the door of climate catastrophe. It's time to go into emergency mode, or our chance of reaching net zero will itself be zero. He certainly has a way with words. So coming back to the glass half empty, glass half full, I think the half empty bit has to be that we're still on track to very significant warming, with the final text being much weaker than had originally been hoped. But on the positive side, I think there were lots of positives. There was a focus on 2030. It does seem to be, as Boris Johnson said, the death knell for coal. There is an agreement to come back next year with better targets. Nature was actually front and centre in this whole COP. So a friend of mine who's been to 16 of these meetings said he'd never heard the word nature mentioned so often. So phrases like nature-based solutions, nature-based, nature positive, natural capital were absolutely a central theme. And finally, there is a lot of money finally flowing. Let's hope that really has an impact. So finally, where's Australia? Well, here's my report card for the Australian government. We did go to the COP with a net zero target. It was last minute and it's 2050, which is a decade too late, but you know, better than nothing. There is no credible plan to get there, even though in my view, the Prime Minister used the word plan 101 times when he presented the Australian way. Most people find the so-called plan incompetent to the point of being funny. We did not take 2030 stronger 2030 targets. We've still got our very, very weak Paris targets that were weak then. They're even weaker now. We didn't sign the methane pledge. We didn't sign the coal pledge. We did sign the ending deforestation pledge, but it's not clear what the government's actually going to do. We are not committing our fair share of climate finance. Only about 10% of our fair share has been committed. And the Australia Institute has estimated that there are over 100 fossil fuel projects, coal and gas, currently in the pipeline. The Australian government does not take climate change seriously, which was illustrated on the last day of the conference. There is a prize given called the Colossal Fossil to the country that has been, I quote, the least helpful in the negotiations. And once again, it was given to Australia. So on the international scene, Australia has been highlighted as absolutely the worst, most unhelpful performer in this space. So to finish up then, we are in a climate emergency. It is much more than a slogan. It is absolutely reality. We are seeing our physical and biological world transforming before our eyes. We haven't got much time to turn this around. It's what we do in the next decade that really counts. Every fraction of a degree matters, because every fraction of a degree is doing us and everything else on the planet harm. That means that every year that we delay significant action really matters. And that means that every choice matters. You know, we've got the climate change catastrophe because of billions and billions of poor choices. And we have to start making billions and billions of much better ones. So I will leave it there. That is the choice we face, a biodiverse, healthy, clean world, or continuing on with energy sources from the 18th century. Please go to the Climate Council for resources. I'm sure most of you are aware of them. They include an explainer of both the IPCC report and the COP, and much more besides. Thank you very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Lesley. That was a wonderful summary, and Emma put that in the chat as well. Such a brilliant summary that you shared there of both the IPCC report and also of COP26. I thought there's a few questions coming in on the chat, and I'll get to them in a second. But I just wanted to stay there with the end of your presentation there about where we are. You sort of gave a great summary there of Australia's position, which is so wonderful to hear. There's not the results of it, but just to hear where we're situated. And I'm wondering what recommendations or what you can say to what we can be doing. Us personally here, most of us are in New South Wales. Most of us work and live in New South Wales. These are big international climate conferences that happen on a huge scale. What learnings can we specifically take from it, and what can we be doing?
Well, look, I think the COP re-emphasised to most of us that we need to act despite the vacuum of leadership on this at the federal level. I mean, the good thing about Australia is that we are seeing real leadership from many of our states and territories. I mean, all of our states and territories have had net zero targets for some time. Some of them are moving very, very rapidly towards those targets, you know, and a good shout out to Matt Keane as the Energy Minister and Environment Minister in New South Wales, who's really leading a lot of that charge, but also places like South Australia, who I think, was it last week or the week before, basically produced more than 100% of their energy from renewable resources. The Victorian government's just switched on the biggest battery in Australia in Geelong, you know, Tasmania with their hydropower, et cetera, et cetera. So the states are really going in the right direction, despite the lack of leadership. You know, it would all be made much more easy and much more rapid if there was clear policy at the federal level. But at least people aren't using the lack of leadership at the federal level as an excuse to do nothing. So that's good. And look, in terms of what you can do, Andrew, you know, what the environmental educators are already doing is exactly what needs to be done. You know, continuing to send the message out via your network in a distributed way to teachers and others that then inform their students and their colleagues and their friends and all of that sort of thing. It is absolutely, you know, we're seeing so much action at the grassroots. You know, the school kids strikes just being one example of that. And that's what we've got to keep doing. And look, you know, we are seeing coming up to a federal election at the next year, sometime between now and next May. I think it's going to be really interesting because we're seeing lots and lots of independents standing who are on a climate platform. And, you know, the Climate Council is a non-partisan organisation, and I'm not here to tell anybody what party to vote for, but you know, all I would say is get the message out to people to make climate action the #1 reason as to how they assess the candidates in their election, in their electorate rather. So, you know, I think you know, climate is going to be an absolutely critical issue at the next election, maybe even more so than ever before. And providing people with the sort of information that they need to actually assess differences between candidates, I actually think your organisation is very well placed to do that. Also in a non-partisan way.
Yeah, thank you. And that's certainly what we're trying to do with these climate catch-ups, is to amplify these messages and help our educators all across New South Wales to be integrating that climate message into whatever program they're working on. And Erica will speak a little bit to that in a little bit. There was another comment in the chat there from Amanda. She said, "Thanks, Lesley. It was really well explained and really helpful." She said, "Thanks for not shouting or crying. You must be incredibly frustrated." I share that. Wonderful to hear such a succinct summary of it and delivered so well. That you must be incredibly frustrated. So how do you personally deal with the scope and the scale and the weight of the climate crisis? It's such a mammoth thing to grapple with and deal with. You seem to handle it so well. Do you have any tips for anyone out there that is struggling to comprehend it all?
Look, I think firstly, hi Amanda, lovely to hear from you. And below Amanda is a comment from Paul Davies, who, yes, we did go to university together. Hello, Paul, lovely to see you in the chat. That was a long, long time ago, as we both know, but great that you're here. Yes, look, it's frustrating. I guess what helps me is that I've been in this business for 30 years. You know, I started doing climate change research in 1990, and I have seen, you know, and in those days it was a sort of a future, you know, academically interesting thing to think about, but not the issue that it is today. And I've seen the exponential growth, not just in emissions, but also in interest and concern. So in a sense, I take maybe a longer view on it, which is easier to cope with personally than people that have come into this area more recently and sort of suddenly become concerned. So I guess that helps. I would also I'm going to reach up and show you this post-it note that I have above my computer in my office, and I'll read it out. I've read this to lots of people. It's a quote from Desmond Tutu, and every time I feel frustrated and angry, I just remind myself of this quote. So Desmond Tutu said, "Do your little bit of good where you are. It's all those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world." And the first time I read that, I immediately wrote it on the post-it note and put it up above my computer, because everybody can do something, nobody can do everything. And I think, you know, for me, whenever I do feel overwhelmed, I remind myself of that quote and I think, okay, what is it that I can do? What is it that I can do well? I will try and spend as much of my time as possible doing those things, and hope that all of the other people that are as concerned as I am are doing their little bits of good, and together eventually we overwhelm the world. And that's all we can do. None of us can take on the entire weight of this issue. None of us can. If we can just all individually focus on what we do well and keep doing that to the best of our ability, That's all we can do. And then that's a sort of also a quite a liberating thought. If we think to ourselves, well, I can't do everything. I'm not going to worry about trying to do everything. I'm just going to do this bit. That's how I do it.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it is liberating when we can focus on what we can do personally in our own spheres of influence. And that's where I see our roles as environmental educators, integrating this climate message into whatever we do. And it brings it down to whether it be a water program that we're working on or a waste education program, there's a little climate message that we can put in there. We don't need to take on the full weight and scale of everything. There was a couple of other questions in the chat there, some that came in from Wendy. You mentioned the fossil fuel attendees at COP26 this year. And I saw a lot of commentary around that as well, that there was a lot of attendance from fossil fuel lobbyists. Is that something that you think should be limited for future COPs for Egypt next year?
Look, no, I don't think so. I mean, you know, COP has to continue to be a sort of a democratic organisation. If we start saying, well, you can't come if you've ever had anything to do with coal, where does that end? We're all probably using electricity at the moment that is at least partially coming from coal. So no, I don't think it should be limited, but I do think that over time, perhaps the very number, I don't know how many, if that number is more or less than were there last year or at Paris or whatever. I haven't seen a trend line in that, but perhaps maybe it's a good thing, a good indication that those fossil fuel companies are getting more and more worried, and that's why they sent so many people. And if they're getting more and more worried, it means we're winning, sort of thing. So maybe it's a good thing. I mean, one of the slides I should have shown, I suppose, but I didn't want to spend another hour, is that one of the things that the Australian government was most criticised for was the fact that Santos, which is our second largest gas company, sponsored the Australian Pavilion. And when you turned up at the Australian Pavilion in Glasgow, at least for the first 4 days, Santos was front and centre. So, I mean, what bright spark in the government thought that that was a really good idea? I don't know. Apparently on the first Wednesday night, the Santos display quietly disappeared. And the other thing that the Australian Pavilion did, which is possibly the most useful thing they've done, is that they provided free and very good coffee. So they should have just stuck to the coffee, I think, and at least done something positive for the COP rather than the other things that they did. But yeah, no, look, I think if you've got observer status, everybody should be able to go. It shouldn't be exclusive. I think the strength of the COP is that it is not exclusive, but maybe those companies were there because they're getting worried, as well they should be.
As well they should be. And there was one other question in there, looking to the future as well, and it was framed around India's approach and their 2070 targets. And you also discussed that as well in terms of the commitments for the next COP. And so I'll ask you, what are we looking for from the next conference? And is that goal of 1.5 still alive?
Well, I don't think it's still alive to not overshoot it. I mean, I think, the physical science tells us that we're going to overshoot 1.5. I think that's, short of a meteor crashing into the Earth, which would be bad in itself. I don't think 1.5 is alive. But so it's sort of, from a scientific perspective, we will overshoot 1.5. We've got to try to avoid getting to 2 and to then draw down as much greenhouse gas as we possibly can to bring things back down under 1.5. So the overshoot is, I would say, almost inevitable from a scientific perspective. But that doesn't mean giving up. That's the important message, I suppose. Yeah. And in terms of India, look, the significant thing about India is that that net zero target, which is 2070, is still the first time they've had a net zero target. So that was seen as a positive thing in itself. You know, net zero for any country by 2070 is too late. And, you know, India did not cover itself in glory by literally at the very, very last minute saying, actually, we're not going to sign this until phase out turns into phase down. And I guess what I should have reiterated is that there is no final declaration from these COPs if even one country refuses to sign. So that's why these negotiations can be so fraught. They go on all night, all day to try to get some level of agreement. And that's why they're always less than what we would like, is that they're a consensus document. So the only way to actually have a final document, you know, India played classic brinksmanship at the end and said, we're not going to sign if it's phase out rather than phase down. You know, John Kerry, ever the optimist, put his spin on that to say, well, in order to phase out, we have to phase down first, so let's go with that sort of thing. But that's why the end of the COP was a little bit subdued. Poor old Alex Sharma, who was the president of it, you know, pretty much broke down on that last day with emotion. I mean, the stress that guy was under would have killed most of us, I think. But look, you know, we moved forward, not as much as we could, but it was forward rather than back.
Yeah, and you mentioned that a lot of the warming is already baked in, but what you also mentioned, which I think is really important to remember, is that every fraction of a degree counts. Yeah. So it doesn't matter if we meet 1.5 or not, every fraction of a degree counts. Yeah. And in our previous climate catch-up, we heard from Willie Luisi from the Pacific Islands, and we'll share a recording to that one as well. We can hear the impact and the emotion that he has when he speaks about the impact that climate's already having on his homeland. So thank you so much, Lesley. That was such a wonderful presentation. We're going to hear from Erica now. Erica is on the executive committee at A2E2 New South Wales. And she's going to speak a little bit about A2E2's climate emergency response.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Lesley. So for the last 2 years since the New South Wales mega bushfires and the global youth climate strikes, our New South Wales chapter has been on a journey to shift our focus towards the biggest environmental issue facing our people and our planet. I think, Andrew, are you able to share that presentation when you get that up? So look, you know, as we know, the climate crisis, it is the mother of all environmental issues. And as Andrew mentioned, it makes sense then that as environmental educators, we need to integrate our messaging around climate into the work that we do, because, you know, whether we educate people about biodiversity or oceans or rivers or food or, you know, water or waste, we have an opportunity to engage our New South Wales community with the climate crisis. So, you know, it doesn't mean that as environmental educators, we should, you know, stop working on these programs. It just means that we have a really great opportunity to think about how we can integrate climate education into the work that we're doing. And we really do believe at A2E2 New South Wales that every environmental educator and every environmental professional is well placed to help change the climate story from that of despair about climate catastrophe and fear of economic loss to that of positivity and opportunity for the better, cleaner and fairer future we will create with a net zero world. And with a network of over 400 environmental educators in New South Wales alone, we firmly believe in the impacts that we can have on our communities and workplaces to move towards a net zero world. So that's why all of our A2E2 New South Wales business, activities and decision making now address the climate emergency. For the last, as you can see from our timeline, over the last few years, we've been doing a lot of work I've been leading this climate emergency response, and as you can see, we're working on getting our own house in order so that we can walk the talk in the global climate space. We made the declaration, we've got a net zero emissions 2022 plan, and we've also got a climate emergency plan, which I'll just touch on briefly now. So we adopted our climate emergency plan in June of this year. So our mission with this plan is to support all you wonderful climate leaders to communicate a hopeful and inspiring vision of the regenerative future our global community can create. People need to believe that we can do this. So our goals for this are to support our members and learn from you, acknowledge our climate grief with fortitude and hope, collaborate with our partners and create new alliances, lead with courage and humility, and not forget that the best way to restore our well-being and our resilience in this challenging time is through our connection with nature. So what's next for A2E New South Wales in 2022? We are continuing with yes.
Just before we get to that, I'll just thank Lesley again and say goodbye. I know she has to head off at 2. So thank you so much, Lesley, for joining us. Such a wonderful presentation, and we hope to see you again in the new year.
Thanks, Lesley. So
I'll see you later.
Thanks, Lesley. So what's happening in 2022? We're continuing with our climate catch-ups, and we're going to be focusing on some of the really exciting nature-based solutions to the climate emergency. We're going to be looking at how we can all walk the talk in this space, and we're going to be looking at our personal resilience because that is very important for us. And we have a new professional development workshop offering that we're really excited to talk to you about today. So we're running workshops next year on changing the climate story. So knowledge is power, and we want these workshops to help you mobilise your community or your workplace to join in our global race to zero. There are going to be 2 workshops under 2 hours and over 2 weeks. So what are we going to be covering in the workshops? Knowledge is power. We're going to be getting everyone up to speed on climate science, politics, markets, and the exciting international climate programs and how they are driving our global race to zero. We'll be looking at the future for New South Wales with our country's most ambitious state government, New South Wales Net Zero Plan, and how your community or workplace can join in. We'll be learning from inspiring case studies of environmental educators who are changing the narrative in their communities from one of despair about catastrophe and fear of economic loss to excitement for the better, cleaner and fairer world that they're creating to make net zero a reality. We will practice using our A2E 10 communication tips that hopefully you've seen, to really equip yourself with the tools to turn fearful questions and negative statements into opportunities for curious conversations and sharing real world stories of the community benefits of moving to net zero. Everyone who completes the training will join our A2E New South Wales Climate Community of Practice so that you can receive regular peer-to-peer support and new ideas. So look, just to really reiterate what Lesley was saying, we have the knowledge, we have the science, we have the technological solutions, and we have the nature-based solutions to solve the climate emergency. What we have been lacking is leadership. In fact, Catherine Wilkinson, a US climate scientist, has described the climate crisis as a leadership crisis. So this is where all you come in. As passionate environmental educators, people look to us as the source of truth on environmental issues, and our sphere of influence in our communities, workplaces, and family and friend groups is very significant. And we are leaders, whether we like it or not. And what we do inspires others to do more. So we really look forward to working with you in 2022 and over the next years as we race to get emissions down by 2030. We know what's at stake. There's nothing more important that we can do as environmental educators. So thanks for your time, and I'll hand back over to Andrew.
Thanks, Erica. And thank you, Erica, for all the amazing work that you do with A2 New South Wales. Those 10 tips were put together by Erica, and they're a wonderful resource.
My COVID project, my COVID gift.
Yeah. So we have run a little bit over time, and it's just hit 2 p.m. So if anyone does need to head off now, feel free. But a big part of the climate emergency is our own personal resilience. And so for the next 5 or 10 minutes, we're going to break out into some smaller groups so that we can connect and share after hearing all of that wonderful summary from Lesley. So if anyone does need to go, now's a good time to head off. Thank you so much for joining. And we're going to pop everyone else into some rooms. So we'll be in there for about 5 or 10 minutes. So make sure that everyone in your room has a chance to share. Introduce yourself, where you come from and what you do, and then any feelings or thoughts or reflections you had after hearing that summary from Lesley. Chai is going to put us into some breakout rooms. Thank you. Hi everyone, welcome back to the main room. Should have a couple more people trickling back in. And we'll hand back to Sue just to wrap up briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And thanks, Erica, for really encouraging us environmental educators to step up as leaders. And that's wonderful. It is my pleasure just to thank all of you for participating today and to really taking on that message that Lesley has given us from COP26 to just keep going. Glass half full, I heard. It is also letting you know that the Australian Association of Environmental Ed is looking to do a national, and Steve Fuller, who talked about EFS and Education for Sustainable Development, will hopefully have some more to share with us. I do want to ask all of you to have a wonderful break over the Christmas season and look after yourselves. And I think that's the best thing we can do as environmental educators, and get ready for that federal election and get ready to really call to task all of those in our community around climate. And again, we are also apolitical, so not actually saying anything about what we should be doing, but having climate as our centre. I do also hope that you will stay in touch, and I do know our conference is coming up in April next year, and this will be a wonderful opportunity for us to gather, for us to share, link, learn and share with each other. And it is our opportunity as environmental educators to really learn from each other. And our Costa Georgiadis is really keen to join with us, our ambassador, and I congratulate him on his win at the ACTA Awards last night. So I think with that, we go back to our day jobs, and do hope you'll join us at our climate catch-ups, which we do want to keep as that snippet of lunchtime. So I won't keep you any longer, and just thank you all, and we will stay in touch and hope you will stay in touch with us. So thank you.